The tires crunched over snow as we rounded the final bend, the cabin coming into view just as the sun dipped behind the mountains. It looked exactly like the pictures, quaint, tucked into the trees that picturesquely hid a roof that needed replacing, the kind of place someone more optimistic might describe as charming. I wanted it to feel charming. I wanted Claire to see it that way too. "Here we are," I said, forcing a little enthusiasm into my voice as I pulled into the narrow driveway. Claire didn't respond. She was staring at her phone, thumbs scrolling slowly, her face bathed in the faint blue glow. "Looks nice, doesn't it?" I tried again, louder this time. She glanced up, eyes flicking to the cabin, then back to her screen.
"It's fine,"
she murmured. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. Fine. Of course it was fine. That's how everything was with us these days. Just fine. The wind picked up as I stepped out of the car, sharp and bitter against my face. The sky hung low and heavy, the snow swirling in lazy drifts that would soon grow into something heavier. I turned, taking in my surroundings. The cabin sat perched on the mountainside, the winding road we'd taken visible below, snaking through the trees like a thin, fragile thread. The road had split and veered back toward town a quarter-mile before, leaving only a slick, cobbled driveway behind. For the first time in months, there was no sound of traffic, no hum of engines or distant voices, just the wind, growing louder by the second, and the soft, eerie hush of falling snow, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, suffocating, until you're not sure whether it's the world holding its breath or you. I looked back at Claire, still sitting in the passenger seat. She'd finally looked up from her phone and seemed to really be taking in the cabin. For a second, I was hopeful that she was excited to be here, but I quickly realized her face was washed with a vague disdain for the building. "Can you grab your bags?" I asked, leaning back in the door. She sighed, a little too loudly, and climbed out, shivering as she zipped her coat and put her phone in her pocket.
"It's freezing."
"It's December in Colorado," I said, trying for humor. "What did you expect?" She didn't laugh. The cabin door resisted when I pushed it open, the wood swollen and warped from years of wear and weather. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of pine and something musty, the dull, damp scent reminding me of our little apartment back home. The floors groaned underfoot as I stepped in, the sound muffled by faded rugs and soft wood. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, and a small kitchen sat off to the left, its appliances outdated but at least appearing functional. To our right, a narrow hallway with 2 doors and a pull-down attic string seemed to be the way to our bathroom and bedroom. Generic framed paintings and kitschy souvenirs adorned the hall, gathering dust, telltale signs of a home that had been long delegated to live out its days as a holiday rental. "It's cozy," I said, setting our bags down by the door. Claire brushed past me without a word, heading straight for the couch. She dropped onto it, pulling her phone out again and scrolling as if it were the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. At least she looked comfortable to finally be out of the car. I sighed, my breath puffing out in the chilly air as I set our bags down. "I'll get the fire going." The fireplace was old, caked in soot, and looked like it probably hadn't passed an inspection in decades, but there was a neat stack of logs and kindling waiting beside it. I knelt down, striking a few damp matches until one finally lit and coaxed a flame to life. Warmth crept into the room as the fire caught, long shadows dancing across the wooden walls. "Better?" I asked, glancing at Claire. She looked up and flashed me a curt smile and nod before burying herself again in her phone. I found myself soured at the realization that her signal here must somehow be decent enough to keep endlessly scrolling. I busied myself unpacking, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing minute. The snow had started falling harder now, the wind rattling the windows. The cabin groaned softly, the sound deep and patient, like a long-held sigh. I paused, listening, but it was just the home shifting under the slowly increasing burden of the snow on the roof. "At least this place has some character," I said, trying to break the silence. Claire didn't respond. I sat down next to her, rubbing my hands together as I tried to ignore the vague dampness of the couch. "Look, Claire, I know this trip isn't exactly your idea of relaxing, but I thought—"
I'm tired.
She cut in, standing abruptly.
I'm going to bed.
"Claire." She was already walking down the hall, her footsteps sharp against the creaky floorboards. A door shut, and I was left alone with the fire and the sound of the growing storm outside. I leaned back, staring at the dancing flames. I pulled a blanket out of one of my bags and was relieved to find that the couch reclined.
Maybe it would be best if you slept on the couch tonight.
Claire's words from days prior rattled through my head. It hadn't just been that night. We hadn't slept in the same room since. I had hoped that would change tonight, but I resigned myself to fall asleep by the crackling fire. The cabin let out another low groan, the sound making the hairs on the back of my neck prickle. I looked out the window once more and realized that the growing storm had become a blizzard. Cold air blew in through the crack under the front door, and I could tell my car wasn't moving anytime soon. It was going to be a long night. Morning crept in slowly. The storm outside reduced to a dull whisper of snow against the windows. The fire had died overnight, leaving the cabin bitterly cold. I dragged myself off the couch and pulled on a sweatshirt, shivering as I walked into the kitchen. Claire was already up, sitting at the small table by the window, her coffee mug sitting in front of her on the table, untouched. She wasn't looking at her phone, which felt like progress, but her eyes were fixed on the snow-covered trees outside. Her head was tilted towards the hallway, as though she were listening for me coming. "Morning," I said, grabbing the remaining chipped mug from the counter.
Morning.
She replied quietly, not turning to look at me. I poured myself some coffee, the pot nearly cold since she'd made it. She must have been up for hours. "The storm looks like it's easing up," I said, leaning against the counter. "Maybe we could take a walk later, get some fresh air." She made a vague noise of hesitant agreement, but her body language was closed off. Legs tucked under her, shoulders hunched. It wasn't outright hostility, but it wasn't exactly welcoming either. I watched her for a moment, my coffee growing colder in my hands. I couldn't stop myself from thinking about the things she'd said to me during our last fight, words that had settled into me like splinters.
If you want to book that stupid anniversary trip, go right ahead. You just bulldoze ahead like what you want is the only thing that matters.
I took a deep breath and turned away, sipping my coffee. That's when I heard it, a faint sound, just on the edge of my perception. I froze, tilting my head toward the hallway. It was so faint that I couldn't be sure I wasn't imagining it, like the hum of an appliance or a distant murmur muffled through walls. "You hear that?" I asked.
Hear what?
Claire's voice sounded annoyed, but she glanced over her shoulder towards the hallway as well. "That, I don't know, a noise. It sounds like talking, singing maybe?" She frowned.
It's probably the wind.
"Maybe," I muttered. We finished up our coffee and put our mugs in the sink. We'd long fallen out of our habit of washing dishes together, and there wasn't a dishwasher in sight. As I began to slip on my boots, Claire slowly shambled to the bedroom, with no indication that she'd be getting dressed for our walk. "Aren't you going to join me, honey? The storm's clearing up. It'll be nice to get out of here for a bit." There was a moment of silence, and I thought she would ignore me once more. But after a moment, her voice mumbled through the cracked bedroom door.
This trip will be a lot easier for the both of us if we don't have to pretend. Go on your walk. I'll be here on my phone.
My anger finally burst forth, having been restrained in an attempt to salvage this trip. "You think I'm the one making this harder than it has to be? You're impossible to talk to, Claire," I shouted towards the door. I heard her stand, feet shuffling towards the bedroom door, and it slammed shut. The house groaned in response, then settled, and once more the silence was swallowed up by the faint murmuring noise coming from the hallway. The noise didn't go away. As the day went on, it remained at the edge of my awareness, faint but persistent. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to maybe wind blowing through a hole in the roof, or perhaps even a small animal seeking shelter from the cold. It made me uneasy. There was a familiarity to the noise that I couldn't place. We ate dinner in near silence, the tension between us heavy enough to fill the small kitchen. Claire pushed her canned pasta around her plate, barely eating. "Is it bothering you?" I asked finally. She looked up, startled that I'd broken the quiet.
Is what bothering me?
"The noise. I thought maybe—"
I don't hear anything,
she said quickly, cutting me off. I opened my mouth to argue, but stopped myself. I'd learned by now not to tell her when I thought she was wrong about something. Instead, I finished my meal in silence, the faint static prickling at the edge of my hearing. It wasn't until we were piling our dishes in the sink when the cold wind stopped entirely for the first time since our arrival, and the sound was louder than it had ever been. Claire turned her head towards the hallway, and I grinned. "So you do hear it." I'll admit I was a little smug when she rolled her eyes at me.
Fine, I hear it. But it's nothing. Just this stupid old cabin falling apart.
Claire turned to walk towards the hallway, and I began to walk towards my makeshift bed on the couch when she turned towards me, sighed, and gestured for me to join her in the bedroom. I happily took my blanket from the couch and finally went to bed with a little warmth. As I fell asleep, I dreamt of our wedding day. It's ironic, on a trip that was intended to celebrate our 5th anniversary, it was the first time my wedding had even crossed my mind. I dreamt I was at the altar, holding hands with my wife. Her palms felt cold and clammy in my own, and she looked upset. I looked at her, trying to imagine a future in which we could be happy, but her scowl burnt holes through my hope. As the minister began to conclude the ceremony and asked if anyone in the crowd held objections, a voice rang from the audience. I turned towards the crowd and was shocked to see Claire, or yet another Claire. She was dressed comfortably in the sweater she'd worn on our first date. She looked radiant, smiling like how she used to, and was eagerly trying to get my attention.
Jason, I love you. Come here, come to me, please, don't do this,"
she cried as though it were of utmost urgency. I turned back to my bride-to-be and was taken aback to find her withering before me. Her skin sallowed and stretched tight over her bones, her rosy cheeks deflating and her eyes growing darker. I couldn't look away as she guided my hand to her side, wet with blood. I awoke in a cold sweat to the noise from above. It was louder now, unmistakable. Not static exactly, but something uneven and distorted, like voices filtering through a bad connection. I sat up in bed, heart thudding in my chest. Claire stirred beside me, groaning softly.
"Jason?"
she mumbled. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't answer right away, but her face tensed as she strained to listen. The sound wasn't just faint anymore. It was distinct, tangible. I could finally make out the noise. It was voices. Rushed, muted speech, garbled by a grumbling static, the words muddy and indiscernible.
"Is that a radio?"
she asked, sitting up. "I think so," I said, already climbing out of bed. We followed the sound into the hallway, our footsteps loud on the creaky floor. The noise grew stronger as we neared the end of the hall, where a pull-down attic door sat flush with the ceiling.
"What the hell?"
Claire muttered, staring at it. I reached up, tugging the ladder rope down with a loud groan of wood and metal. It didn't budge. Claire fished her phone out of her pajama pocket and shone her flashlight up towards the attic door. There was a small 4-digit padlock holding the door shut. The owners clearly didn't want any guests entering the attic. The noise was much clearer now, a steady static interspersed with faint bursts of garbled speech. "You think the owners left a radio on up there?" I asked.
"Maybe,"
she said, though her tone was uncertain.
"We should call them."
I nodded, pulling out my phone. The number that was left on the Airbnb listing went straight to voicemail. I left a message, trying to sound calm but insistent. "Guess we'll just have to deal with it for now," I said, uneasy at the thought of leaving it playing all through the night. Claire's expression hardened.
"Deal with it? How are we supposed to sleep with that going on?"
"I don't know, okay?" I snapped, my annoyance bubbling over and giving way to anger. "What do you want me to do, break in?" Her eyes narrowed.
"Don't start."
"I'm not starting anything," I shot back. She stormed off without another word, the bedroom door slamming behind her. I stood alone in the hallway, staring up at the attic door. The static buzzed in my ears, louder now, almost rhythmic. It felt like it was waiting for something. The next morning, I found Claire in the kitchen again, standing by the counter with her arms crossed and a mug of untouched coffee sitting beside her. She wasn't scrolling through her phone this time, just staring out the window as the storm's remnants swirled in slow, aimless patterns. The radio hadn't stopped. It had finally grown quieter in the early hours of the morning, but now it was back, faint but persistent, distorted speech pouring through the ceiling, filling the air with tension. "You didn't sleep, did you?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. She turned her head slightly, just enough to glance at me from the corner of her eye.
Hard to sleep when there's a radio running all night.
I sighed and leaned against the doorway. I already tried calling the owner again when I woke up. What do you want me to do? Smash the lock and risk paying for damages? Her shoulders tensed, and I could feel the argument building before she even opened her mouth.
It's not just the noise, Jason.
She said, turning to face me fully now.
It's the voices.
They're faint, I replied, brushing her concern aside. It's probably just some talk show or something.
You don't know that.
She snapped, her voice rising.
It's creepy. It's weird. And you're acting like it's normal.
I'm not saying it's normal, I said, my patience wearing thin. But I'm not going to lose my mind over a busted radio in an old house either. Her eyes narrowed and she stepped closer, her voice low and sharp.
You're always like this. You act like I'm crazy for being upset, like everything's my fault because I can't just relax like you.
That's not fair, Claire, I said, my jaw tightening. You're acting like I put the damn radio there just to piss you off.
Maybe you didn't, but you sure as hell aren't doing anything about it.
I opened my mouth to fire back when something stopped me. A voice crackled through the static, clearer and louder than anything we'd heard so far. You think I'm the one making this harder than it has to be? You're impossible to talk to, Claire. I froze. Claire's eyes widened as she stared at me, her face pale.
Did you hear that?
I hesitated, trying to process what I'd just heard. It's nothing. Probably just...
Don't,
she said, her voice trembling.
Don't tell me that wasn't you.
It wasn't me, I insisted. It's...
Jason, that was exactly what you said to me yesterday.
The static broke again, like a scratched record, and the voice resumed, now faint but unmistakable. Stop putting this all on me, Claire. You're just imagining things. I didn't go anywhere tonight. I took a step back, my stomach twisting. It wasn't just the words. It was the cadence, the exact rhythm of my voice. Claire's hands trembled as she pressed them to her forehead.
It's you're doing this,
she said, her voice sharp and brittle.
You're trying to mess with me, with my emotions. Do you think it's funny?
What? No, I said, my own voice rising now. Claire, how could I even...
You've been trying to fix this trip from the beginning, haven't you?
She spat. She began to hyperventilate.
Like we could just patch everything up if somehow you controlled the situation.
I'm not controlling anything. The static surged, loud enough to make my ears ring, and through it came another burst of words, this time in Claire's voice.
You're so damn selfish, Jason. You only care about fixing things on your terms.
Her face crumpled as the words registered, and she looked at me like she'd been slapped.
That's from last summer,
she whispered.
When we fought about my job offer. That's me.
I opened my mouth to deny it, to tell her she was wrong. But then I heard it again. Her voice, warped but unmistakable, repeating the exact words I'd heard her yell during that fight.
You want to fix everything, Jason? Why don't you fix yourself first?
It wasn't just random. It was us. I backed up against the counter, my pulse pounding in my ears. What the hell is going on? Claire shook her head, her face pale and her hands still trembling.
I don't know. I don't want to hear it anymore.
She turned and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the bedroom door behind her. I stood there, staring at the ceiling where the faint sound of static hummed steadily through the boards. A chill ran down my spine as the sound shifted, and for a moment, I thought I could hear the creak of footsteps from above. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to keep me rooted in place, staring up at the locked attic door, as Claire's garbled voice echoed through the attic again.
I don't know why I ever married you.
Time blurred into itself, the storm outside returning to bury the cabin in deeper drifts of snow, and the sound upstairs filling our world with a ceaseless, mocking static. At times it would go quiet, just long enough for Claire and me to let our guards down, consider talking about something, anything beyond our own misery. But right when I thought we might have a chance at conversation, the radio would crackle back to life, louder and more intrusive than before. It was a few days in when I realized that it wasn't just replaying our worst arguments anymore. It was anything we'd spoken to or about each other. I heard my own voice from months ago telling a friend how Claire doesn't see me, how she makes everything a battle. A while later it shifted to Claire's voice, raw and sobbing, confiding in her sister that she didn't know how much longer she could endure me. I recognized every word, every breath, because I remembered her phone call that night. She'd locked herself in the bathroom, and I'd pressed my ear against the door. I had never regretting being nosy as much as that night. Here it was, echoing through the attic, laid bare. Every time the voice became clearer, I'd see Claire's face tighten, a tortured mix of guilt and fury. We couldn't escape each other's taunts, or the house's apparent need to throw them at us like daggers. We hardly said a word to each other, circling each other in the small cabin, surviving on canned soup and stale crackers. I tried calling the owner again and again, leaving voicemails that grew more frantic with each attempt. My calls went unreturned, my hope dwindling with each missed connection. Claire's phone signal was the next to go. She'd tried to scroll through social media, text her friends, anything to distract herself, but no matter where she stood or where she tried, her phone could barely muster one bar. She sank onto the couch, eyes full of tears that she refused to let fall in front of me.
We have to leave,
She whispered on our 5th day in the cabin, her voice trembling as she stared at the swirling white chaos through the window.
Jason, I can't stay here anymore.
We had discussed leaving the day before, but the weather had barely permitted us to open the front door. It hadn't let up much since then, but the desperation in her voice shook me. Without another word, we bundled up, thick coats, gloves, scarves. I helped tie her boots. There was something almost tender in the gesture, and for a moment I wondered if we could reconcile, to pull ourselves out of this nightmare by sheer force of will. But stepping outside was like entering a frozen void. The wind whipped icy needles of snow at our faces, and the driveway was half buried in drifts. I dug at the car door, yanking the icy handle open only to find the interior of the car felt as cold and lifeless as the air around us. The engine refused to turn over, coughing twice before going silent. I glanced at Claire. Her eyes darted to the steep, unpaved road that snaked down the mountain. Even if the car started, we'd be risking our lives trying to maneuver those icy curves. We looked at each other, and I knew she felt as defeated as I did. We trudged back to the cabin, fighting each step through the wind. My fingers had gone numb in spite of my gloves. Claire was shivering violently, a silent terror in her eyes. When I finally managed to force the swollen cabin door open, that now familiar static rushed out to greet us. And then I heard it. Claire's voice upstairs, as usual, speaking words I wished I'd never have to hear. She sounded almost gentle, but her words were damning.
I'll leave him soon.
She said, her tone calm and intimate.
He doesn't have a clue.
My heart lurched. Real or not, it felt like a blade twisting in my gut. I glanced at her. Her eyes were wide, tears threatening to spill. The betrayal fresh even though those words were her own. She looked at me, shook her head, and without speaking, retreated to the bedroom, shutting the door quietly behind her. I stood there, snow melting on my boots, face stinging from the cold, and listened to the static pick up again. The cabin creaked in the wind, sounding almost like a soft, mocking laugh. I could only stare at the dying embers in the fireplace, wondering if anything in our lives would survive this place. As the relentless static from the attic wore on, it seemed to scrape away at the edges of my sanity. The voices unearthed every bitter line, every whispered complaint we thought safely hidden. The cabin felt like a cage, trapping us with an auditory barrage that knew no bounds. Each new revelation, whether a conversation once held secret or a venomous whisper shared in confidence, added weight to an already unbearable tension.
You're just too much, Jason. Always fixing, never listening.
Exhausted and desperate, I found myself fixated on the attic. The padlock, an old rusted relic, mocked me from the ceiling hatch, a barrier to whatever twisted machine perpetuated our torment. I needed to get it open, needed to find out what was happening, but every traditional method had failed. No amount of pleading with the unresponsive owner or searching for a misplaced key had yielded any results. It was just Claire and me, growing more estranged with each passing hour. "If you're going to stay this distant forever, Claire, you might as well just leave." Determined, I approached the hatch again, armed with nothing but a sense of determination. I grabbed a chair from the kitchen, positioning it under the attic's pull-down string. The padlock dangled just out of reach, an enigmatic sentinel guarding our tormentor. Did I even want to find out what was up there? The need to stop the voices overpowered any hesitation. I fetched a small toolbox from under the kitchen sink, the one that barely saw use, and rummaged through it for anything that might help. I came up with a couple of old screwdrivers and a tarnished set of Allen keys. Not ideal, but it was all I had.
Why bother, Jason? It's over, isn't it?
I ignored the jibes, focusing on the padlock. I tried each tool systematically, twisting and prodding in a futile attempt to force the mechanism. I eventually gave up on trying to break open the lock, and in my desperation, resorted to trying any and every combination I could think of. My hands, raw from the metal and the cold that seeped into the cabin, worked mechanically. Time lost meaning as I moved from one combination to the next, fueled by a mix of fury and a desperate need for silence. Hours must have passed, the light outside dimming to the early twilight that predicted another long night. The numbers blurred before my eyes, each click a mockery as our voices cried from above.
"She's going to leave, you know. Can't you tell?"
My brother's voice seemed to boom down at me from above. I winced as I anticipated my next words.
"Let her. I don't need this hassle any longer."
The frustration and shame built within me like a physical force, a crescendo that demanded release. As I furiously put in every 4-digit combination I could think of, the realization hit me like a brick. I stopped on a new combination, 1231, today's date, but more importantly, our wedding anniversary, a detail that had slipped from my conscious mind but lay buried, a remnant of happier times. With all of the remaining effort my frigid, tired hand could muster, I pulled. The lock clicked open. Relief washed over me, quickly chased by apprehension. What would I find up there? Claire had arisen from the couch and watched, her face a mask of mingled fear and curiosity. Her silence was a gulf between us, but this act, opening the attic, felt like the first truly shared moment in days. I pulled the string, and the ladder creaked down, dust dancing in the air disturbed by its descent. We both flinched at the sharp, echoing sound of the radio, clear as day, coming from above. I hesitated, my hand on the ladder. The air felt charged, thick with the anticipation of what was yet to come. The static above us quieted for a moment, as if the attic itself held its breath.
What are you afraid of, Jason? You're a coward. Just run away from it all. Isn't that what you always do?
With a deep breath, I started to climb. The ladder groaned under my weight, each step a creak of old wood. Claire stayed below, her face upturned, watching me ascend into the darkness above. As I approached the top, the chill of the attic wrapped around me, a cold whisper against my skin. I paused, flashlight in hand, ready to sweep away the shadows and uncover the source of our torment. I couldn't bring myself to turn it on, to see what was up here, at least not alone. Instead, I turned it down towards my wife and extended my hand down to help her up. As Claire and I reached the final step of the attic ladder, a chilling silence enveloped us, broken only by the echo of our hesitant footsteps on the floor. It didn't feel like the rest of the cabin. It felt cheap and warm. Linoleum? The beam from my flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing a sight that made my heart skip a beat. The sight before us wasn't just impossible, it was chilling. We were back home, in our crappy little apartment, or at least a perfect replica of it, Every detail was meticulously reproduced. The arrangement of books on the shelves, the crease on the sofa cushion, even the small, almost imperceptible stain on the carpet near the TV stand. It was our home, duplicated with an unsettling precision, as if someone had taken a snapshot of our lives and recreated it here in the dusty confines of the attic. The air was unnervingly still, thick with a tension that seemed almost palpable. It felt as if the room was holding its breath, waiting for us to shatter the quiet. The musty smell that I'd noticed when first entering the cabin was amplified to the extreme, and was permeated with an iron metallic scent that sent my stomach churning. My eyes swept the room, searching for the source of the voices that had tormented us. We didn't own any radio, nor a record player or any speakers for that matter. Instead, my gaze landed on something far more familiar, my laptop, open on the coffee table, its screen aglow. I ran over to the battered device, tripping over its power cord as I went. The laptop sat neatly on the table, as the mouse plugged into it moved of its own accord, clicking the screen every few seconds. My eyes darted to the smudged screen, and discovered that it was open to our security app. I'd installed cheap cameras around the apartment soon after we moved in. I'd told Claire that they were for our own safety, but in truth, they were for me. To revisit our arguments, to replay every fight we had, searching for vindication in the details. The computer was clicking from clip to clip, playing a highlight reel of every terrible thing we'd ever said to or about each other. Claire joined me, her steps slow, almost reluctant. Her eyes widened in horror as she watched the screen. I looked back down at the laptop, only to realize that it had changed once again. I immediately recognized the fight. It was the most recent one before we'd left home.
Claire, would you listen to me? It's 2 weeks, you'll live. It'll be nice and quiet.
Who says I even want nice and quiet? I want to get back to real life, Jason. I haven't worked in months. And you planning these surprise trips to try to patch things isn't helping me find a job.
So what? I canceled the booking? I already paid the deposit, Claire. We can't get that money back. Or did you forget I'm also working a dead-end job?
If you want to book that stupid anniversary trip, go right ahead. You just bulldoze ahead like what you want is the only thing that matters.
I watched myself furrow my brow and then put my head in my hand.
Claire, I'm trying here, I really am. But I can never get through to you, can I? First it was you passing on the job offer when we needed that money. Then it was that thing with your ex.
I told you nothing happened, Jason. He just stopped by for coffee is all.
Claire, I'm not stupid. You turned off the cameras, but the audio was still recording, you idiot.
Don't you dare call me an idiot after all I've done for you.
I watched as Claire had stormed towards me, and our fight was about to escalate. She pounced at me, but I threw her off of me towards the kitchen. I watched her crack her head on the edge of the table and fall through it. I walked up to the table slowly. I observed her breathing grow shallow as she lay spasming on the floor. I watched her breathing stop as blood slowly pooled around her. I watched myself stand up calmly, then walk into our bedroom. A minute later I left, quietly wheeling our luggage towards the front door and leaving as my wife lay motionless. Then, as if sensing its audience had seen enough, the laptop's battery icon flashed once, critical, and the screen went black. The sudden death of the device plunged me back into silence and darkness, a quiet so deep it was almost suffocating. The absence of the voices, which had been such a constant and invasive presence, now left a shallow emptiness that was somehow worse than the noise. I sat for a moment, unable to process what I'd just seen. I turned my flashlight up towards Claire, only to see that I was now alone in the room, the dull smell of iron growing ever stronger from the kitchen. I shakily turned my flashlight again, this time towards the kitchen table, shrouded in a cloak of darkness that I hadn't dared breach since I ascended the attic ladder. There, lying crumpled in a heap of splintered wood, lay my wife. Dried blood had pooled around her head, and I winced at noticing that her neck was bent at an unnatural angle. She had begun to bloat and stiffen, and the closer I stepped, the more the iron scent of blood was replaced with a musky, rotted smell. She was almost entirely a corpse save for her eyes. Fresh and watery, they were locked onto me, silently accusing me. Claire? I whispered, praying with every fiber that somehow she was still in there. But she didn't respond, didn't move. She lay frozen, staring intently, eyes following me as I nervously swayed. The air around us grew colder, denser, as if the room itself was closing in, feeding off the rising panic. Then, almost imperceptibly, Claire began to whisper. The words were soft, disjointed murmurs at first, guttural sounds forcing their way out of a broken, bloated throat. As I drew closer, the whispers grew clearer, sharper. They were not the comforting words I yearned for, but a continuation of the cascade of cruel, cutting phrases I'd grown accustomed to.
You never really cared, did you, Jason? It was always about you, your needs.
Her voice was a ghost, devoid even of its usual disdain, hollow and haunting. I stood frozen as her whispers intensified, layering upon each other in a relentless, cold assault.
You're so selfish. You think you're the victim, always playing the martyr.
Each word sliced through the already frigid air. The whispers swelled into a torrent of accusations.
You suffocate me, Jason. I can't breathe with you, can't grow. You're a dead weight dragging me down into your misery.
I stumbled backward, hands clamped over my ears, but it was futile. Stop it, Claire. Please get up. This isn't okay. Please get up.
You should have known I was too good for you. I wasted the best years of my life on a fantasy that you'd change.
Her face, so familiar and yet so warped, contorted as her dead lips struggled to keep up with the verbal onslaught. The storm outside seemed to echo her fury, the wind howling against the walls as if in sympathy with her rage. Overwhelmed and unable to bear it, I dropped to my knees, the cold of the floor seeping into my bones. Claire's figure, crumpled across from mine, began to crunch as her frame contorted itself so she could continue to lock eyes with me. Her expression was blank, but her eyes piecing as she continued her litany of grievances. I crawled, sobbing, searching in the dark for the attic door that led me here, but it had long vanished. The floor was solid, as the roar of the frozen world outside began to muffle, snow piling against our artificial windows. Her voice was the only sound, a relentless echo in the ghostly replica of our apartment. Her words didn't stop for hours, and by the time she began to quiet, she had managed to stand up and loom over me, cold and pale, whispering accusations and curses at me in the dark. It has been weeks since the door to the outside vanished, leaving me trapped in my own home with the whispering thing that was once my wife. Claire, or the thing that used to be her, grows more gaunt by the day, her features sharpening, her eyes sinking deeper into her skull. She's starting to smell worse, but she keeps whispering. She isn't going to harm me, not physically. She can't. Her body, crumbling and decaying, only has the energy to torment me with its gaze and with its words. I've tried the front door, but I don't think it's any more than decoration in this mockery of my home. It doesn't lead outside. It doesn't even open. It's just part of the wall. The storm outside has not abated. I can hear it sometimes through the thick snow that covers my windows. If the snow ever subsides, the windows may be my only chance at escape. I'm typing this now as both a record and a plea. If you're reading this, if this somehow finds its way to someone, anyone, do you know when the blizzard near Denver will let up? Is there any forecast about when the snow will start to melt? It's cold in here, and I don't think I can listen to her for much longer. Hello there, thank you for watching. How did you like the creepy atmosphere in this story? I'm genuinely curious if this story was creepier than usual. Do let me know in the comments below. If you want a similar story, check the story on screen. Lastly, if you've enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Stay creepy, and see you in the next story.